I'm very happy to be here tonight, also because it's the first time that I am able to speak about my work in India, and having made two very important projects in India, this is a great opportunity for me to share this with you, and I'm also looking forward to your feedback or questions you may have. But before I start, maybe a brief introduction about myself, about my upbringing. Important to note when looking at my work or reading the work is that I grew up in many different places as a child, especially around Southeast Asia. My mother, when I was very young, who's also here in the audience tonight, moved with me to Indonesia. We also lived in Australia for a while. We spent a bit of time in India too, and I also lived in Singapore for 6 years. I spent my high school education there, and it was only when I was 18 years old that I moved back to Belgium to pursue higher education, where I studied photography. So I studied photography in Ghent at the Art Academy, where I did a bachelor and a master's degree in photography, and am now pursuing a PhD in documentary photography. So the work I'm going to begin with is titled The Fourth Wall. All the works I make are books, so I work towards a book form. Shilpa and I will have a kind of Q&A at the end of the talk where we can discuss more about that. But keep in mind that the slideshow of the images you are seeing are the images that are part of a book, and here you see them individually, whereas in a book you see them in context, of course. So I'm just going to let the images roll on screen while I talk about it. And we can skip back and forth if necessary. If anybody has a question, maybe save them for after the talk, and then we can go into a discussion. So what interests me the most in photography is the documentary genre, or the documentary approach in photography, because I think this is where the essence of photography gets pushed most to the foreground. Photography always deals with reality in a sense. You always have to photograph what's in front of your lens. It kind of has a descriptive quality, right? It's different to painting that you can't just make something up and bring it to the canvas. You have to literally photograph something. And in documentary photography, you're also trying to say something about reality. You're trying to deal with photography's relationship to this reality. You're trying to tell a story about something that's happening in reality. So these questions about how photography relates to what it's trying to document or trying to show is very much at the center of documentary photography. Now, of course, reality is a very complex thing, and it's very difficult to kind of claim any kind of truth or reality when you make a photograph of something, because it transforms, it becomes something abstract, it becomes a two-dimensional kind of quiet, still image, which essentially doesn't have so much to do with the reality that you try to grasp in the first place. It kind of loses its connection to it in a way. So photographs occupy this gray zone between showing something in reality, but at the same time becoming something abstract, becoming something ambiguous, becoming something that kind of sits in between. And that's kind of space that I also try to occupy with my work. I try to see how photographs or documentary photo projects can try to engage with reality or say something about reality in all its complexity. So not just believing in a kind of objective power, descriptive power of a photograph that shows how something is or what something looks like, but also tries to engage with, for example, how our imagination or how we kind of project certain things on photographs, how we read them, how their context changes depending on their combination with other images, with texts, and so on. And especially how photographs are not simply one-to-one representations of a kind of objective reality, but are so much more than that. And if we look at kind of classic documentary photography, we see this tendency where a lot of the times a lot of weight or a lot of importance is given to this registration of what is seen by the camera or what is registered by the camera, but it often stops there. It doesn't go much further into questioning deeper questions about how we as people relate to the reality around us, or how photographs try to deal with this kind of blind spot of the reality they try to capture. Okay, that was a kind of a big abstract introduction to kind of my views on documentary. And in the meantime, you've been seeing images on the screen which come from a body of work titled The Fourth Wall. The Fourth Wall, as a title, references to it's a title from theater where you have 3 sides of a stage, like we have here. We've got a left side, a right side, and the back, and the fourth wall is a kind of imaginary wall that the audience and the actors imagine that is there, because the actors don't acknowledge the audience, and the audience pretends to be looking at some kind of spectacle on the stage. In cinema, for example, you have a term called breaking the fourth wall, and that's when an actor looks at the lens and directly addresses the viewer. The fourth wall already hints a little bit at the subject matter of the work, which in this documentary project I tried to show how influential Hindi cinema or Bollywood film is on kind of everyday perspective of reality. Little Vigo doesn't seem to be all too interested in the talk. So this influence, as most of you probably know, is kind of everywhere. It's an important part, I think, of how things are perceived, and I experienced that directly when I visited Mumbai a few years ago, before I began with this project, where I was cast by a film studio while I was walking on the street to play as an extra in the background of one of the film shoots. It was a film that supposedly took place somewhere in Russia or something, and they needed foreigners to dance in the background. So I immediately took on the job just out of interest and experience. But that's where I kind of witnessed firsthand about how this cinema industry works, and being on set and seeing how these films are made, and also being there as an extra and part of this film. So when I had to think about a subject that I was looking for, this is made in 2011 and 12 as my master degree project at school. I thought back to this experience I had as being an extra on a film in Bombay. And I thought that would be an interesting subject to make a documentary around, because essentially it's something abstract. How do you photograph the influence of something? There is no singular subject. There is no way of literally pointing your camera at something and saying this is an expression of how influential cinema fantasies can be. So in the beginning, Victoria and I, my wife, who's also maybe just left with our newborn baby, went to Bombay for about 5 months, and we started trying to figure out how we would make this work. We began by visiting a lot of film sets, by photographing on set while preparations were made, photographing set pieces backstage, like this one, for example, or anything that kind of literally had to do with the Bollywood film industry. And but I soon realized that was just documenting the cinema industry, and it wasn't really, again, going into these deeper questions that I had or wanted to show. So after trying a few different things and figuring out how we would approach it, we began simply photographing in the streets of Bombay, where we would set up our camera. We use a lot of flashlights, artificial lights. This comes from previous works that I've made, the development kind of aesthetically and technically of how I got here, we can also discuss later. But basically, these images look theatrical. They look as if they could be film stills, or if they could be made in this kind of cinematic context. So we have quite a lot of equipment, and that's why Victoria and I worked on this together. And what we noticed is that when we would set up our cameras, I would usually look for a place in the streets that had a kind of, let's say, decor-like quality. So something that looked a bit artificial or looked a bit as if it could be on a film set. There are plenty of places like that around Bombay. So from the moment we would kind of install ourselves, we would see that quite quickly lots of people would begin to gather around us to see what we were doing. Out of curiosity, maybe they thought they would see a famous person being photographed, or maybe they just simply wanted to know what we were doing. So within a couple of minutes, there would be maybe 30, 50 people around us watching what we were doing, and then spontaneously people would kind of present themselves in front of the camera to be photographed. And then someone else in the crowd would take up the role of the director and begin to direct people. Or there was a young man, Pankaj Chowdhury in Bombay, a teenager who immediately came by my side and opened up an umbrella above my camera, as if, these things that they see from knowing how the Bollywood film shoots look like. And the moment that happened, I realized that performance or situation in itself was actually a beautiful expression of how this kind of cinema fantasy comes to life in a very spontaneous way. And Victoria and I decided to make that our working methodology. So from that point on, we decided to kind of wander the streets, mainly of Bombay. We were also in Chennai for a while, the places with the biggest film studios. And we would make images with people that we kind of met in the streets or would present themselves to be photographed. Often I would ask them to play out whatever they wanted to play. So after we photographed maybe the 10th fight scene between men, I decided that sometimes I need to direct here and there, or some people would just simply stand there, and then we would go into a discussion and we would come to images together. So they're also made in a kind of collaborative way where obviously the people in the pictures are very much working with me or very much acknowledging the fact that they're being photographed and also contributing to that. So that's how this project came about. And when we went back to Belgium, so it's repeating now, but that's good. When we went back to Belgium, the second phase of bringing this work together began. And then it quickly became apparent that still context is always needed in a documentary. The viewer always needs to have some kind of, let's say, leeway of how to read the work, because pictures essentially are quite ambiguous in themselves. They don't really mean anything. It's whatever the viewer projects onto them, so it's very dependent on the context in which they're shown. And while Victoria and I were working in that period in India, we also read the newspapers. We read about 3 different newspapers every day. And we were always looking for inspiration or stories of things that happened, which we could then collect, or we kept a lot of stuff. But specifically stories in which there was some kind of overlap between the film industry or film fantasy and the real world. Funnily enough, there are quite a lot of these stories in the Indian newspapers. So when we were editing the book, I decided to structure the work around these little stories that we had collected, and those are those big quotes of text that you see appearing on the screen. So as you go through the book, you see these kind of fragments of texts which all come from newspaper articles, real newspaper articles that were published here at the time. But you just get a fragment, so you just kind of have an idea of something that may have happened, to which you again freely associate the images that come before and after those stories. So it's still not making it very concrete. It's still leaving it open to interpretation and leaving it open for your own kind of, let's say, cinematic imagination to be projected onto. But then in the back of the book, there is an index which which shows the entire original newspaper article, so you can read the full stories of what these quotes reference to, and give the book a second reading. Now, just to give a couple of examples of these little occurrences, I might read a few to you. Maybe, let me just skip through it. Sorry about that. I'm looking for a very clear one, so it makes it... so here, for example, you can see often that a story is also combined with an archival image, so this picture was published in the newspaper along with the story. Here you see a little girl whose face is pixelated with a police officer next to her. And this is the story. So in the back of the book you would discover in the index that it's a young girl, the girl we saw in the previous image, that runs away from her rural home, takes all the money she has, takes a train to Mumbai because she wants to meet Salman Khan. And when she arrives in Mumbai at the train station, she starts asking people where Salman Khan is because she wants to meet him. And a man says, yes, come with me, I'll bring you to Salman Khan. And the man takes all her money and then just leaves her on the side of the street. So she was kind of, her dreams had been shattered and she was left without money until a police officer found her. So this is a nice way in which kind of dreams and desires tend to fall back into a harsher sense of reality. The next image then is a stunt double or a lookalike of Salman Khan, which we met in Mumbai. So while sequencing the book, we also chose to take out all of the images that depicted professional actors or actants from the film industry. We had photographs of directors, of actresses and so on, but we chose to remove them from the project and only work with images made with people that are kind of outside of that, or people that we just met in the streets. The level of staging, you could say, or this process of creating an image, the artificiality of it also varies. For example, here in the book there is a reproduction of 2 pages of Maximum City. It's a book that most of you might know, by Suketu Mehta, which is a non-fiction account of the kind of Mumbai underworld, which also deals a lot with the cinema industry and so on. And there's one segment in the book which is a very beautiful description of a scene in which a dancing girl takes a client out on a date, and on their first date, and the girl buys a few birds and lets them flutter loose in the taxi, and it's this kind of flirtatious game where she tells the man, so the suitor, that if he can catch one of the birds, then he gets a kiss, or they kind of brisk each other in the attempt of trying to catch these birds. And this is a non-fiction account, so supposedly things that happened in reality. And because when I read that, I immediately kind of had an image of what that might look like, or this poetry in there of birds trying to be free, fluttering around in a taxi, and this kind of romance that's happening. So I also chose to construct that scene with friends that were living in Bombay. So some of the images are also kind of short, in directly relation to the text that's presented with them. The reason for choosing this subject, which I didn't mention in the beginning, is that what interests me also is how fiction and documentary are kind of intertwined. So the reason for choosing to work with this topic is because I think that the fantasies or the fictions that we have are also constantly projected on the reality around us, and they form how we see and perceive reality. They're very defining for how we live in the world. So I think if making a documentary is about understanding reality, the fictions that govern our reality are crucial to try and incorporate into it. And of course, when you make a photograph, in a sense, you're also fictionalizing. So by choosing a subject which in itself already deals with a kind of duality between fiction and reality, it comes together with my kind of vision on documentary or documentary approach. This is another short article. There was a man that became a millionaire on Who Wants to Become a Millionaire show, the Indian version. This is a quote from the Slumdog Millionaire transcription of the Hollywood film. And this is a film still of the man that wins the $1 million question, and when he wins, he pours a glass of water over his head. And the images that come after that are made in a film school in Dharavi in Mumbai, of which the teacher, who you can see here, these are all the different roles he can play, of which one of his students was an actor in Slumdog Millionaire. So that's again how these things are connected. But in the book, these connections or these things that I'm telling you now are not necessarily made explicit. They stay open. There are reasons for me to bring these things together, and if you look at the clues or look at the hints, you may find those connections. Now, when bringing the book together, we chose to include images that would again point to the literal space of cinema production. So we did include some of the behind-the-scenes, backstage images made on film sets or in cinemas, in order to intertwine pictures made in the streets with these improvised actors, and to bring them again into this kind of cinematic space. Now, the next project I'm going to briefly introduce as I let this continue, because it's relevant to where this story started. When I graduated with The Fourth Wall in 2012, I self-published the book. It was my first book that was really self-published in a larger edition. I was invited by an international arts festival called Europalia in Belgium, who every 2 years kind of collaborate with another host country. It's a very old institution that does exhibitions in Belgium that are kind of culturally defined. Europalia India asked, so this edition was Europalia India. They asked me to go back to India very quickly after I made The Fourth Wall, and to make another project which would then be exhibited as part of the festival. So this was the first time as a student that I was supported to make a body of work, and that wasn't purely independently produced, which was a great opportunity. And that's the second body of work I'm going to talk about, which is called Will They Sing Like Raindrops or Leave Me Thirsty? I will again let the images, so it starts here, I'll let it roll on the screen. So having spent 5 months in India with Victoria, working on The Fourth Wall, and then coming back a couple of months later to begin something new, it was a difficult position to be in, because all our energy and time and kind of perception on what we were photographing was very much defined by this, by looking for this relationship to cinema and this influence of fictional worlds on reality. So we decided to focus on one of the main themes of the kind of popular Hindi film, which is the love story, or the romantic story. But we then decided not to only focus on the same strategy as we did before, which is essentially an abstract subject matter. It's something that doesn't really exist in reality. People are performing, expressing their kind of fantasies. Here we chose to include a very concrete documentary subject, if you like to call it that, that deals with a kind of social issue in marriage or love culture in India. So my mother actually one day pointed out to me that there's this organization based in Delhi called the Love Commandos. Some of you might have heard of it. The Love Commandos already very much sounds like a kind of possible film. But what they do is a bit more serious. So a lot of the marriages, as I understood while I was digging into researching this topic, are based on the arranged marriage system. You know a lot more about than I do, where caste and religion and many other factors play a role. And what the Love Commandos do is they give shelter and protection to young couples that are running away from their families because they chose to be together without the family's permission. And a lot of the times, unfortunately, when couples decide to marry without having the permission of their families, they would end up in honor killings. So this is also something I don't need to explain to you here, I guess, but that's when, out of honor, to save the family's honor, the parents murder their children. So these couples end up running away together, end up with the Love Commandos in a kind of secret shelter. They have secret shelters all over India, where these couples stay. They're immediately married officially by the organization, so they get their marriage certificate, which is sent to their family. They have legal advice, and they help them kind of start a new life as a newly married couple. They help them move away. They help them. They make sure that they're protected when they leave the shelter and so on. So I found that a very interesting topic, because there is this clear contrast or discrepancy between a very idealized romantic notion of love as we are presented in cinema a lot of the times, and then this very real problem where people are running for their lives to be in love, or are being killed because they are in love. And it's, again, in terms of subject matter, for me, interesting to make a documentary about, because it deals with as well these kind of dreams and fantasies and desires that we have, that we project onto reality, and the confrontation with reality itself, where these things sometimes don't fit, or where we try to project our desires onto reality and hope that they may come true. And I think photography or images have an important role to play in that, where the images that we create or the images that we project also have the potential, they can potentially become true. The dreams and desires we have are also dreams that may eventually become true, and they take shape in images a lot of the time. So what we see here on the screen is kind of many different registers of different photographs, and it's in the book that it really becomes more clear, because in singular image slideshow it's a little bit more complex to grasp. But during our talk after this, I will show the PDF of the book, where it's a bit more clear with the context and so on. But the book is structured around pictures that are made inside of the secret shelters of the Love Commandos, with couples that are staying there at the time, all people that in advance had given their permission to be photographed and wanted to tell their stories and so on, because many of them obviously need to remain anonymous out of safety. That's one segment of the book, and you can identify those images. One is coming up soon, because they're all made in this same blue-walled small space. It was a very tiny shelter where 3 to 4 couples lived at the same time, some staying there for up to a year, others for only a few weeks. This is one of the wedding ceremonies organized by the Love Commandos. So those images always return, where in the book they're placed in sequence, so you can see 5 or 6 pictures of that same space coming back. And then outside of that space, when you see images that are not clearly in this blue-walled small room, you see pictures that deal with a kind of other view on it. So Indian wedding situations, which are the kind of other side of the coin, or the other side of the picture. Throughout making the work, also something interesting to use as a visual tool are motifs or tropes. For example, you'll see that the white horse or the white steed in a traditional wedding, the groom arrives on the white horse, is something that keeps returning as well in different forms. And there are a few elements like that throughout the series that come back again. And here you also see that I've used newspaper articles to provide context for how the work can be read. I'm going to get to these images later. So the whole book is a kind of hierarchy of different pictures, a structure of different types of images that are brought together, going from found material to a process similar to in the fourth wall, where pictures are kind of performed and staged, to images of objects like this one. At that time, I was struggling with photography as a medium that is a bit limited to the frame, to the two-dimensional frame. And I wanted to explore how I could intervene more or make sculptures on location, for example, or produce things that would become part of the work that are not photographic, but that all ended up as photographs in the book at the end of the day. I mean, the objects exist and they're shown in exhibitions, but this is an example of a perfume, a little pot of perfume that was produced in Delhi when Victoria and I visited the perfume shop. It was this place where you can walk in and then they have thousands of different scents, and you could ask the perfumist to make the scent of your choice or to copy famous scents or whatever. And I asked him to make me the scent of true love, which is in that little vial there, which contains the smell of the wet earth after the rain and a number of other things. Of course, we also visited the Taj Mahal, which is maybe one of the most iconic architectural structures dealing with love. An example to which I will get later. And there are certain images that reference to other aspects that deal with the marriage issues, such as bridal burnings. I guess most of you are also aware of that, when men, mostly for the dowry, would marry with women, would receive the dowry and would then set their wives on fire and move on to the next woman. I didn't want to specifically focus on victimization or suffering or photograph people in these kind of terrible situations, so I chose to represent issues like that in a more open-ended form by setting a dress on fire. And then you have other images that function as transitions or more poetic pictures in between the different chapters of the book. So here, for example, we're in the shelter of the Love Commandos. So the people you see in these pictures are really people that are running away from their families. So this is the kind of documentary core of the project, and everything outside of that is more of a kind of open connection to it that deals a lot more with projection and kind of cinematic ideals of love. And of course, it is kind of a universal story. I mean, Romeo and Juliet is pretty much the same narrative as what we are seeing here. So that's what I find interesting as well. How do I make a documentary about a certain subject and at the same time tell a universal story which is maybe not just specific to India or specific to a place? And above all, on top of trying to tell that story, also say something about photography itself and about documentary making. I think that's one of the most crucial elements which distinguishes documentary from other ways of photography, is that the documentary has to question itself always. It has to always have kind of self-reflexive standpoint where it doesn't simply tell you a story, it also tells you the story of how it's incapable of actually dealing with reality. And this is what I'm constantly trying to do. I'm trying to kind of walk the line between reporting on something that happens, but at the same time also kind of revealing the blind spots of photography itself. So these images that you see, which are very different to all the other ones, are pictures that I got from a studio in Mumbai, so a photo studio where you can go and have your portrait taken or made. Like the picture of Victoria and myself you saw in the earlier project where we become the actors and the Indian photographer photographs us. Only here we have kind of fictional landscapes. These are places that don't exist. You can tell that they're digital collages. And people would choose these as the backgrounds for their portrait. And in the beginning of the book, we can skip to that later, you also see two silhouettes of bodies that are missing a head, where people can just stick their faces on existing very nicely dressed people. So in terms of strategy, I think this is slightly different to what I showed at the fourth wall, and they're clearly connected to each other. They follow onto the same thread, but the relationship to the subject is different. Here I'm really dealing with people in a certain situation, and it's not only abstract. It's both using the imagination and dealing with an actual situation that's happening. And I think that's where, in general, my work as a documentary maker is heading towards more. How can I bring these two extreme poles of the spectrum together, where you work towards kind of photographic, self-reflective abstraction, but at the same time deal with pertinent issues in society, or give people agency to express certain things that they're dealing with. But then again, within all of these problems, there are also instances where I'm completely free to make images that go beyond purely trying to specifically deal with photographing, for example, a couple on the run. And I think this is a great example where we see a glass of milk being spilled. And one day I read about particular tropes in Bollywood films where in the Bollywood film you rarely see kissing or kind of more directly erotic scenes or sexual scenes, and apparently in the 60s or earlier films they would have certain metaphors to suggest that something erotic is happening, and one of those would be spilling milk. So I decided to use that trope myself as well within the context of my love story, which allowed me to make images that are at the same time completely constructed. This was made on our hotel room. Completely fictional in a sense, but at the same time they also have a documentary value, because this is part of the visual language or tropes of how we perceive certain symbols and images that can mean something within a certain context. In what I mentioned before, of course, when bringing these images together in a book, lots of things change because context is provided. So one of the important things that I was dealing with at the time, and still today, is how much space is provided to the subject matter of the documentary. So in this case, the Love Commandos organization or arranged marriages and so on, and how much ambiguity or open-endedness is left there, so that the subject matter doesn't dominate the entire project. So I'll show you later in the book, the Love Commandos organization is represented by a series of blog posts taken from their website, in which people express their they express their praise for the organization, or they ask for help. They say they're in certain situations and they need someone to help them, and then there are other people that attack them for going against traditional Indian values and so on. And for me, coming from Belgium, or not being familiar with the system of arranged marriages or arranged marriages versus love marriages, at the beginning I had a clear idea that clearly falling in love should be a right to marry whoever you want, and that's just simply normal. And Victoria and I were in these shelters as a couple, talking to these other couples who were running away for being in love. But the more that I spoke to people, and the more that I learned about it, and the more that I read about it, the more I realized that it's an extremely complex issue, and it's not just as simple as one thing being better than another. And this is crucial for my own position in this project, where I don't necessarily attack one thing and praise another thing. For me, I don't want to take a position in which I say that one thing is better than something else. It's much more about showing the differences in how something can be perceived, and how our kind of desires are at the same time universal, but also very complicated, of course, when it comes to social constructions that you're not necessarily a part of as an outsider, or as somebody that steps into something and tries to document that. So, and that's why, instead of, for example, publishing an interview with the leader of the Love Commandos, the organizer of that group, which would place the entire work in their kind of claim of what they try to fight for or achieve, I chose to keep it more neutral, where there are different voices talking about the same problematic, and where you can see that there's a certain polemics around the issue, where not everybody agrees, or where there's a kind of conflict. And this I also find interesting in my way of working, that it's not trying to simply show that one thing is wrong or one thing is bad, like you would have in classic documentaries that very clearly attack a certain problematic in the world, but it's much more about showing the complexities of these kind of things. I will quickly, just as two opposing stories of that appear in the book. As I mentioned earlier, we went to the Taj Mahal, and when I tried to photograph that magnificent building, I realized the only photograph I could make was one that looked like a postcard that already existed. So I decided not to use the images that I produced myself of the building. But as we were walking around outside of it, we noticed the photo studio dumping a bunch of pictures in a trash can. And we immediately collected all those pictures. They were images made by photographers that are there. You know, you can hire them and they take your picture, and then you go and pick up the print later. Images of pictures that people never picked up. So I decided to keep them, and I decided to represent the Taj Mahal, the real Taj Mahal, with one of those found images. But then Victoria and I also came across another story dealing with the Taj Mahal from, his name is Mr. Faizul Hassan, who built a replica of the Taj for his wife that passed away, a concrete replica, not a marble one, in his backyard. So his wife is buried in the building there, and next to her grave there was an empty plot for Mr. Faisal, who I think quite recently joined her. And I think this is another beautiful expression of a relationship of two people, and about how this icon returns. Then on the other side of the kind of spectrum, we have Mr. Din, who we see here sitting in his hotel room in Mumbai. And while he was there, he was interviewing about 20 women a day, because he had posted an advertisement in the matrimonial section where he bought the whole page, in which he kind of advertises himself as a millionaire who's looking for a new wife. So when we came across that in the papers, we immediately called him and asked him if we could photograph him and follow his quest in finding someone. So we met him in his room, we photographed him there, we spoke to him. The entire original article is published in the book. And then a week before we were supposed to go back to Belgium, he called us and he said, I've found the one. And that's Mr. Din with a new wife. They were very happy to have finally found each other. So also in the sequence of the book here, for example, you see she's showing her ring, which then moves on to an image of a TV screen of a woman putting on a ring, and the narrative in the book is kind of formed through these open associations between different images that are connected to each other without ever being explicit. And I think that's, in terms of the photographic documentary, a beautiful way of telling stories, where at the same time you can project your own reality onto the images, which we all always do anyway. But you can also pull it back and by providing context and sequences and bringing certain images together, you create or you suggest certain narratives. The title, Will They Sing Like Raindrops, comes from a film which we saw, a Hindi film, which was subtitled, and there was a scene of a man singing in the rain in a village in Hindi, and the subtitle said, "Will they sing like raindrops or leave me thirsty?" And I noted that down, and I thought that was a beautiful title, again very poetic and suggestive. But I never found out which film that was from, because it was from a kind of montage of many different films, and I think there was a mistake in the subtitling, so it's kind of lost on me, but that also makes it nice in a way. I think I will end there, and we will go into a conversation, and afterwards please ask whatever's on your mind, be it something that deals with the subject matter or something technical or something about photography in general. I'm very curious to hear your thoughts or your feedback. We'll also be around after the talk if you would like to speak personally. Thank you.
About the sort of collaborative process where some of these participants, sort of stage their own performance, or other people who intervened and directed this performance as well. And you talked about being an outsider and photographing in a culture that is different from the one you come from. So I suppose in both the global and the local context that we're in today, that sort of question becomes increasingly relevant. So how do you deal with photographing in spaces or cultures that are entirely different? What do you think would be the virtue of being an outsider in such a space? And what do you think sort of the issues are, and how you would deal with that in your practice?
Yeah, that's of course a very important question, and I think for me a very big thing in what I mentioned in the beginning as well is that as a child, or my upbringing, I also experienced many different places and many different cultures, and I myself don't necessarily identify with one particular place, and I've always been around different people or different contexts, for which I'm very thankful. So that's also part of how I see the world, or part of how I want to interact with different people. And very important for my way of working is that it's never just a spontaneous snapshot of somebody being photographed that doesn't know that they've been photographed, or a kind of stolen image. It's always something that is clearly participatory, so the people in the pictures know that a photograph is being made. I never photograph anyone that doesn't want to be photographed. And I kind of believe in this encounter with somebody, or this encounter in making an image, that in itself is very much part of the work. And there's a kind of mutual understanding on maybe a basic level. They might not be completely aware of the entire concept or the entire context of what the project is about or where it's going and so on. But in a sense you can feel that people are either happy to be part of it or happy to be photographed, or want to have that connection or something. And I think that's a way of being simultaneously an outsider, where you present yourself. Like I said, we would stand in the streets and people would gather around, and then something happens. But at the same time being very open and just having no hidden intentions. I think that's an essential part of it. So in a way, it's a core of a documentary kind of problem, right? You're always trying to go out and tell a story about something that is not part of necessarily your own world, because that doesn't seem important or special enough or whatever. But then you immediately run into these cultural conflicts, or the outside gaze, or post-colonial issues, or and that has to be part of the work. I think it's something you cannot evade. You have to kind of make part of the process, or the work process as well.
All right. I think let's perhaps also briefly talk about the fact that your work is primarily realized in the form of photo books. And exhibition installations that are done slightly differently. So maybe if you can walk us through why you choose to show your work in these formats, also the idea of the photo book as an object in itself, and how you interpret the work in that format as opposed to others.
Yeah, so every project is made with the intention of making a book out of it at the end, which is specific for the way that it's made, because that allows the inclusion of texts, of found material, of creating a kind of work that has a beginning and an end, and everything about the work is encapsulated in that book. It doesn't go beyond it. And the book also never changes, whereas in an exhibition you always deal with different spaces, deal with different contexts, deal with different whatever budget restrictions, or so the work in an exhibition format also always changes, adapts to the space, the possibilities, whereas the book is always the same. And kind of beautiful about the book is also its democratic nature, where everybody can take it home, can look at it at their own time. It kind of lives on with everybody else that looks at it, of course. So I self-publish all my books. I haven't worked with a publisher up till now. And that's simply because no publisher wanted to work with me in the beginning, so I decided together with Victoria to do it ourselves. And we were lucky enough to have an audience for it, and we've kind of maintained it up till now. But that limits distribution as well. So because of practical issues, we can't make the amounts of books that we'd want to, and we don't have access to the distribution market that we would want to. But at the same time, they remain artworks in themselves as well. They come directly from me to the reader, and I think that's also a beautiful thing, that there is no kind of institution in between. They're artist books in a sense.
You said something about the book being, you're saying that it's fixed, but I would say the interesting thing about the book is also that as the reader, you get to go back and look at it again and again, as opposed to visiting an exhibition once, which has limited access in that sense.
Yeah. And the books, they always have different readings. The more you go through them, the more you discover, and so on. There is a discussion about what gets the most eyes, so an exhibition or a book, and then an exhibition has maybe 50,000 or 5,000 visitors. Big ones have a lot more. How many people look at a book, and so on. But a book can be looked at by many different people over time, and in terms of visitors, there's a discussion about that. But still, there is something also, maybe intimate about it, that only you are looking at it and no one else, and it's a reading, so it has more of a narrative feel to it as well.
Okay, so I'm just gonna, open it out to the audience now, and we can hopefully, you all have a lot of questions for Max.
In Belgium, nobody ever asks a question. They're very shy. Yes, please.
So I can clearly understand why you would get all these international awards. It is absolutely almost speechless. It's really amazing, impressive work. So the whole story of why you did it and what you did it, what got you in your life to want to go through this journey of doing this? And where do you think is going to be the next chapter for Max?
That's a good question. That's a question of kind of, I think essentially what drives me to do this is so the whole discourse about what I talked about today deals with questioning photography, questioning representation of reality, questioning kind of how we can deal with telling stories about what happens. But actually, if you take away the photograph and if you take away the representation, the same questions can be asked about how you as a person deal with the reality that you live in. So for me, it's a way of maybe more philosophically or spiritually asking the questions about my reality or how I stand in the world. And it's a way of understanding how I perceive it and a way of dealing with it maybe. And that's maybe a reflection of how I see the world. But then I use photography to show that to other people or to engage with other people. The next project is based in Kenya, which deals with the colonial history of the British, so the British Empire in Kenya and the people who fought against the British, which eventually led to their independence. Doing reenactments with Mau Mau veterans. Mau Mau veterans are people that fought from the forests against the British, and they're between 80 and 107 years old, and we're creating images that tell their version of the story in contrast to the British propagandistic narrative. Yes?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, just a follow-up to the earlier question. I mean, what drove you into this? What keeps you going? Is it the same raison d'etre as in the past, or are you getting some new insights or some new motivational factors that drive you into the future?
What keeps me going is also part of that there is never a solution or an answer to a particular problem. So it's actually always the same problem or always the same attempt at trying to engage with then the documentary as a medium. But there are so many different ways to kind of deal with that or to meander in between the possibilities of that working method, that for me it stays exciting because every project is a different kind of approach to dealing with the same problem in a way. And that keeps it exciting for me to see how I can tell a similar story or kind of essentially a similar way of dealing with photography, but always in a different way, always new new challenges or new stories or meeting new people or learning new things.
Hey Max, I was just wondering, your first project with The Fourth Wall, with representation of women in that, and for very many images that were there, they were mostly of men. Just want to see if it was women who were uncomfortable being in front of the camera, or was it the spaces you were in that were predominantly male-dominated, or what was going on? Because it was only towards the very end that I think I must have seen a couple of photographs with women in it. But yeah, in a later project, obviously there were a lot more women in that. So.
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's indeed something we were dealing with and also occurred to us very much when we were working here, is that women rarely permit or want to be photographed, especially when they're alone. So it was possible to photograph women or to have them there when they were with a man. Most of the time when they were alone, they didn't want to engage, or even though we were a couple and Victoria is also there as a woman, they seem to be less engaging. So that's a very good remark, and I think nobody has ever asked that question before. But it was indeed something that we try to, of course, think about, okay, how can we also involve women in this story, but it's nothing you can also force, or it's nothing you want to impose, because if that's the way it is, then that's the way it is. And to specifically go and search for that and to make that real would then again be counter to what we were doing, is just simply kind of producing images that were a product of how things went in the production process. But I wouldn't know the answer of why that is, or I don't want to be a spokesperson for a particular other culture or society or problem in the world. I'm a photographer, and I deal with photography and documentary and kind of narratives and so on. And I think one of the traps of the documentary maker is that they become an expert in the topic rather than an expert in the making of a documentary. So that's, for me, I'm very grateful to be able to share it with you, because I get these kind of questions which are the right ones. Thank you.
Hi, Max. Thanks for that brilliant presentation. Question for you is, when you're mounting it as an exhibition, how different is it from the way you've presented it as a photo book? And in the absence of text there, how apparent is what you want to say? And what happens to those little scraps that you have pulled out from newspapers and stuff? How is that represented in your show?
Yeah, so bringing the photo book in the exhibition space is really, I think, a lot of people are trying to think about, and you can see in the photo book culture that there is a real shortage of interesting ways to bring the photo book in a space, and it's something that I've been thinking about ever since I began making books. And I have tried many different things, but in these two projects, how I've done it in the past is the book itself as an object is always in the space, and usually many copies of the same book, so 20, 30, 50 copies that occupy the space, somehow all open on different spreads. So you would have, for example, a long line of 30 copies of the book open, which emphasize the text and the context. And also emphasize the book as an art object. And then the images that would be in the space in a larger format would emphasize more aesthetical qualities, more open-ended, abstract images that don't necessarily claim a narrative, that can stand by themselves as kind of images that could mean anything for anybody. So, and there you see a stark contrast between the book form and the exhibition space, where the book form is clearly a lot more narrative and a lot more context and text driven, whereas in an exhibition people would rather experience a kind of spatial aesthetical relationship to a work and not necessarily need to understand the entire concept or the entire story behind it. So in The Fourth Wall and Will They Sing Like Raindrops, these two projects, I worked with light boxes. So I decided not to mount anything on the walls. So the walls in the exhibition are always, well, most of the time empty. And then you would have the book in the space and light boxes that stand on the ground in the exhibition space, which all have rather abstract images that are just kind of aesthetic in their aesthetic, unique, exclusive pieces, whereas the book is a more edition, high number volume work there. So I always hope that people experience the images aesthetically, project whatever they want onto them, go to the book, understand the context of the story, and then can go back to the images to project that new understanding onto them.
I don't know if you had seen that exhibition when we had included you in the Tasveer Journal many years ago, and that was the only photo book that we did. And how we showed the photo book was by dismembering the photo book, and that itself got pasted on the wall as the entire exhibition. So the exhibition was the photo book,
yeah,
in a
indeed,
sense.
Yeah, that's. I didn't see the exhibition, but I saw the beautiful book, of course. So.
Yeah, Max.
Yes.
I'm
Son.
curious about one sees the cinematic structure of the body of work, whether it's a book or an exhibition. And what I'm curious about is, how do you deal with things being scripted or intended versus what is accidental, and how does that direct the rest of the work?
Yeah, that's a great question. It happens on many different levels. Let me just stop at this picture, for example. So in one sense, things are scripted or preconceived or thought of, that's an image that I want to make, or that's where I want to go to. But part of the beauty, of course, is that things happen that you don't have under control, and that end up being a lot more interesting than what you initially wanted to do. And one of the reasons, so in the way that I work is quite controlled. It's not intuitive and reactionary to what's happening. It's a controlled photographic environment where the framing is decided, the light is decided, and then something spontaneous happens within this controlled environment. So it's kind of opening or allowing spontaneity or chance or things that happen, but still within a very controlled frame. And it's the coming together of those two things that specifically interest me, because then there's always something that, you know, surprises you. Or if you work on film, analog film, like these projects are made, it's only in the development or when you scan the negative that you see certain things that you may not have been aware while photographing. But then on another level, for example, with this one, this is you can't see it very well, but it's a pink cloud of smoke. So Victoria and I, we thought we just simply liked how smoke looks in pictures, because they have this quality of creating a shape and disappearing. And colorful smoke has something magical, could be connected to some kind of cinematic effect and so on. So in a kind of intuitive way, we were on a film set of a television series in Mumbai, and I decided to put a pink smoke bomb in a bedroom of a set, a decor of a film set. And that's this image you see here, this pink cloud of smoke. And it's only when we came back to Belgium and during the editing process that we found in all the newspaper articles that we collected a little story of two thieves that broke into an actress's house using sleeping gas, where they put everybody to sleep and then robbed the house and got away with the loot. And when they were caught later, they confessed that they got that idea by watching a film in which that method of robbing was used. And that's where the kind of pieces fall together. All of a sudden, this image I had made of this pink cloud was connected to that article that we had in our archive. And so these coincidental elements also appear in the editing and the sequencing and the building of the narrative, not only within the frame of making the picture.
Hi, Max.
Yes.
I was wondering, isn't the scripted nature of some of your work at odds with the documentary aspect of it? And like, how do you strive to reduce your own biases in producing the work that you do, because you emphasize on sort of capturing reality as you experience it and not like have too much of your own opinion on it? So how do you, like, is there a process to reducing your biases in this?
Yeah, that's the question of I think bias is maybe not the right term. Of course, you want to achieve something and you have a specific view on how you want to create an image, but at the same time, you're trying to document or represent reality. But part of the reason why I arrived at this more cinematic, more constructed, more theatrical way of working was exactly to emphasize that all documentary photographs are biased, that every image is a construction on many different levels. And it's exactly that reason why when you look at these pictures, you doubt between is it spontaneous, is it real, or is it constructed, and is there a bias behind it? And those are the questions that I want to create with the work as well, because when you look at an image in the newspaper, it's maybe more biased than these images. And when you start critically questioning the images that you see, and they're kind of a lot of the times ideological agendas behind them, political agendas, or financial, economic agendas, then you start to see within photojournalism and documentary that everything is part of a construction. Now, there is a difference, I think, between fake news, where you deliberately confuse people for your own gain, and critically questioning images, where you try to look through the deliberate confusion and manipulation and ask the right questions about if something is presented to you to make you believe something, and if so, what is it, and to whose gain? And I think maybe that's part of the documentary maker, to kind of take up that position where we ask people to critically reflect on the images that we see.
Do you want to very quickly tell us a bit about the speculative documentary photography while we're talking about this?
Yeah, so I started a research group at the Academy in Ghent. So there are many different people working with documentary like myself, there are other researchers, but all from different perspectives in terms of medium. So we have a research group in which we have a documentary theater maker, two documentary filmmakers, and a couple of documentary photographers. And we've realized that documentary is actually not something medium specific, but rather something on its own that stands not above, but it's kind of interdisciplinary. So you can approach documentary using many different ways of dealing with it. Documentary theater in combination with documentary film, or documentary sculpture or painting. And part of our research group, which is called the School of Speculative Documentary, is attempting to define documentary as a kind of gesture of uncertainty in which many different disciplines can come together and attempt to not define the documentary, but maybe look at it from a different way, where it's all about dealing with or engaging with reality through representation or art, where the documentary really becomes something on its own. And the term speculative, of course, points to the fact that we can only speculate about what we try to understand, and we can never really claim a single position of authority, or we can never really say that this is true with absolute certainty, and that it's always kind of dealing with your own blind spots, dealing with your own position, speculating about what could possibly happen or what could possibly be an outcome of something through making the documentary.
As many of the questions have shown, many of us have some familiarity with what you've done in terms of the subject. But the blurb that introduced you talked about what you've done in North Korea. And I wondered if you could show us something of that, particularly because, you're talking about speculation. As far as North Korea is concerned, I think everything is speculation.
Yes, indeed. Okay, I can briefly pull up the PDF of the book that Victoria and I made in North Korea. I won't go too much into depth about it because we're running out of time, but so yeah, I had the opportunity to go to North Korea together with Victoria on an assignment for the New Yorker magazine at the height of nuclear tensions between the United States and North Korea in, was it August 2017, when Trump was calling Kim Jong-un Rocket Man and Kim Jong-un wanted to bomb Guam. That's when we were in Pyongyang. The New Yorker thought it would be a good time to go. And of course, that's an interesting space for me again to work in, as from what I've talked about is exactly this idea of never being certain about what you're shown or what you see coming out of North Korea. But at the same time also questioning the narratives that we are being told about North Korea. So it's not only dealing with the North Korean narrative, but also thinking about how we deal with our own kind of, the propaganda that we are shown about North Korea. So basically all the pictures in the book are made in a context where we're guided around to different places by two government officials, just Victoria, myself, and the American journalist, Evan Osnos. And I tried to make pictures that looked, again, had this artificial quality, using a ring flash technique this time instead of a more cinematic technique where everything looks a bit too good to be true, where everything looks normal and nice, and which is exactly also the image that they are trying to promote as a state. So instead of trying to show the real North Korea, or kind of like pricking through this propagandistic veil, I just embraced it and made a series of images that, in their artificiality, tells us that we're supposed to read them in a negative way, that something is clearly missing from the picture. And the title of the book, the Red Ink, kind of makes that clear. So the book is called Red Ink. It's a small book. It feels a bit like a children's book or something. And in the back of the book, you have the source of where the title comes from, and it's a joke by Slavoj Žižek, a Slovenian philosopher. And he tells this joke about a Siberian worker in East Germany during the DDR, who was also communist. And the worker gets a job in Siberia, so he gets to leave. He gets to leave the country. And before he goes to Siberia, he tells all his friends that they should establish a code, because most of the letters are probably going to be read by the censors. And they should have a code so that they can still communicate while having their letters read. And he says, everything that I write in blue ink is true, and everything that I write in red ink is false. So he goes to Siberia, and he writes a letter to his friends back home, and he says, it's fantastic here, you know, there's an abundance of food, the apartments are huge, you can watch any film you want in the cinema, the only thing you can't get here is red ink. And that's the same as these images. We know that we cannot see the real North Korea. But because we know this, because we know the code, we also read them in a kind of inverted sense.
Okay, so I think that's a wonderful note to end tonight's program with. Thank you all for coming out. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. Thank you so much, Max.
Thank you everyone.